this is the BBC. Overnight, German forces have landed in strength across the south of England. We go live to our correspondent in Somerset.
They've attacked us everywhere. Look, Weybridge is a right mess.
Oh my goodness, have they bombed it?
No.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run? We are the boys who will stop your little game. We are the boys who will make you think again. 'Cause who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think old England's done?
In the 1930s, fascism was on the rise. Less than 20 years after the war to end all wars, there was another one planned. And this time, the British government appeared to be turning a blind eye and following a policy of appeasement. It took the small Somerset town of Bridgewater and a famous by-election to change that policy. In September 1938, the British and French governments caved into Hitler by signing the Munich Agreement and effectively sold out Czechoslovakia for the promise of peace in our time. This was the reality of appeasement. But in Bridgewater, a by-election was held. The popular radio broadcaster and News Chronicle journalist Vernon Bartlett was elected on a policy of standing up to fascism, opposing appeasement, and defending Czechoslovakia. Hitler was not a happy Nazi and reportedly choked on his breakfast and vowed a terrible revenge on Bridgewater. Probably, though that's not actually recorded. Less than a year later, Britain was at war. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland and British troops crossed the English Channel. Once again, the British would have to stand up to another country's dastardly empire building with their own empire and the French Empire. But things didn't go well. Despite the kind of valiant resistance you'd expect from the Poles, Poland was quickly conquered and 250,000 people had died, the majority being civilians. In the West, the Allied armies paused and for the next 6 months stayed paused. In England, we were out of the range of those dastardly German bombers, especially Bridgewater. In fact, more people were killed in accidents during the blackout than in enemy action during this time. But people were worried, as was the government. The bomber will always get through, was the fear. War will come from the sky, said H.G. Wells. And people had witnessed the horrific bombing by the fascists of Guernica in Spain in 1937, and now a whole nation as Poland was blitzed into submission. The Germans had conquered Czechoslovakia and now Poland. In April 1940, things changed as the Germans invaded and conquered Denmark, and then Norway, diverting British troops and the Royal Navy across the North Sea, and then in May, a major offensive westwards. First, neutral Holland fell within 4 days by a combination of bombing, paratroopers landing in the city centres like Rotterdam, and rapid tank attacks. The offensive continued into Belgium and British forces were engaged. On May the 10th, the Chamberlain government fell and Churchill became Prime Minister. The next day, the Germans broke through the French lines at Sedan and split the Allied forces. The British army was in retreat with only the sea to fall back on. And back in Britain, the new government started planning for a possible invasion. On the 14th of May, Anthony Eden announced the creation of the Home Guard, local defence volunteers. In fact, an armed citizens' militia, something no government had even countenanced before, but now they had to. And crucial here was the socialist writer Tom Wintringham, who had fought as an international brigadier in the Spanish Civil War, and as a result urged arming the working class under the slogan, "A people's war for a people's peace." Ironically, he was himself never allowed to join, as it barred communists and, of course, fascists, probably for the best, that last one. But this wasn't the Dad's Army of TV legend. Large numbers of these volunteers were experienced veterans of World War I and knew how to handle weaponry. In Dad's army, you might have seen a motley bunch of shopkeepers and bank managers, but in the most, the Home Guard was working class. In Bridgewater, 6 platoons were created, including one entirely from railway workers and one from cellophane workers. And now they had to organise and train them. Within a few days, they were armed, well, with armbands. But no matter how many armbands were issued, this wouldn't stop Hitler. He wasn't a terrible nice bloke at the best of times, and he knew he had to smash the British, or at least make them submit and become a vassal state, so that he could turn his real attention to the Soviet Union. And there, of course, were people in the British ruling class who thought maybe that might not be such a bad thing. And the British weren't doing that well. On 19th of May, General Gort gave the order to save the British Expeditionary Force, and by the end of the month, the miracle of Dunkirk had happened, where the whole army, plus quite a lot of French and Belgian troops as well, had been whisked to safely, sadly without their equipment. The British Army, in fact, had some of the best light tanks and heavy guns in Europe, but now they were, well, in Europe, and the army was back home. Weapons, fuel, rations, medical supplies, and crucially lots and lots of transport vehicles were all in the hands of the enemy. And with the fall of France, the enemy was now on the English Channel, and England was no longer out of range of German bombers. And British shipping became an easier target for German U-boats. But Churchill was having none of it. He said, in his many biographies, his whole life was leading up to this moment. On 27th of May, the Home Defence Executive was formed, and General Ironside was told to find a way of defending against an invasion. And without very much mobility, he came up with stop lines, such as the Taunton stop line, which we're now calling the Bridgewater one, because in fact Taunton wasn't even in it. These were lines of static defence which protected first the landing points, but should they not hold, then secondary defences such as ours, and finally the GHQ line itself. These were designed to protect primarily London and the industrial Midlands. So the enemy and our own people now knew we meant business. Coastal defences were thrown up, such as this pebble-dashed pillbox at Porlock, and the strong line itself. From Bridgewater to the Devon coast, a secondary stop line was created along the line of the River Parrett. Along the Bridgewater-Taunton Canal, which ran alongside the river, creating a no man's land between the two, hinging on the canal, river and rail confluences at Creech St. Michael, and then down to the old charred canal, which was re-excavated and linked to the River Act and then down to the coast. If this line failed to hold, then the levels would be flooded and troops would fall back to the final GHQ line covering Bristol. This line ran from Highbridge to Glastonbury via Godney along the River Brue, then up to Frome, and then joined the Kennet and Avon Canal, and with its headquarters charmingly set in the Beckington Tea Shop in Wells. On the 1st of June, the police were armed, a big psychological moment for the British people. On the 4th of June, Churchill gave his stirring rallying speech, "We will fight them on the beaches, in the hills, in the streets, on the landing grounds," essentially giving away all the British plans, and turning to a colleague famously but quietly adding, "And we'll fight them with the butt ends of broken beer bottles, because that's bloody well all we've got." And on the 13th of June, the ringing of church bells was banned, only to be rung again in the time of invasion. 14th of June, Paris fell, and Churchill announced the Battle of France is over, and we expect the Battle of Britain is now to begin. Hitler knows he has to break us in these islands if he's to win the war. And the Germans started to assemble invasion barges along the Channel ports. U-boats roamed the shipping lanes of the Atlantic, attacking supplies. Ireland remained neutral, its ports and harbours potentially dominating the western approaches. Neutral states hadn't, however, fared terribly well so far in this war. What if they should come from the west? The Bristol Channel was fortified. And on June the 30th, the first British possession was taken, as the Channel Islands were occupied by the Nazis. And by July, Britain itself was being bombed, and the RAF fighting desperately to hold off superior numbers. On June the 18th, Burnham-on-Sea was hit. 2 people were killed, 70 homes damaged. And to prove that no one was safe, some bombs also hit the villages of Mark and Cossington. Bridgewater hadn't seen much evidence of war so far, although within days of war breaking out, 800 children had arrived by train from London and shepherded into Eastover School, issued with a bottle of milk and given a medical, and then sent out to local residents for their safety, as London was expected to be bombed sooner rather than later. On 1st of August 1940, the first bomb hit Bridgewater. A massive landmine landed at Bankland Farm, out by Fordgate, creating such an impact and leaving such a crater that in the early morning light, the first responders were surprised to see hundreds of elvers hanging glittering from the trees. On the 14th of August, Heinkels were intercepted over Puritan Hill on their way to bomb Cardiff. One crew found itself parachuting into the arresting arms of the Bridgewater Home Guard, who inflicted 1 casualty. In fact, a fellow called Herr Flick. On the 24th of August, the air raid sirens sounded in Bridgewater itself. 200 incendiaries were released over the brickyards by Cranley Gardens, Colley Lane, and across the river into Southgate Avenue, where 3 houses were destroyed and several people killed. That included ARP warden Len Wilkins, as he was putting his boots on, and housewife Daisy Ballum, who was found the next day, sat in her chair under stairs, peeling beans for Sunday dinner. Bridgewater has faced its first act of war, but would it be the last? No. Hitler knew that if he was to defeat Britain, he would have to land troops here, and to do that, he would have to destroy the RAF, so that his forces could roam freely across the skies and facilitate landings. But he would also need to sweep the Royal Navy from the English Channel. And Britain was alone. Neither the USA nor the Soviet Union were in the war at this stage, and the German army had already conquered 9 countries, including France, which it had failed to do in 4 years, and now it did in 4 weeks. How easy would Britain be? Would Ironside stop lines work? On September the 7th, the church bells rang out across southern England. It was a signal for invasion. Massive German air raids hit the final RAF bases within range of the Channel, and then concentrated on the Channel ports, backed up by the recall of U-boats from the Atlantic. The RAF was destroyed, and those elements that weren't were compelled to withdraw to the north of England. The Royal Navy was bottled up in its home ports and excluded from the Channel by minefields and submarine activity. The code word Cromwell was issued. Incidentally, a last-minute change of plan, as the original code word Caesar unwisely had referred to somebody who'd successfully conquered England. German paratroopers quickly landed in the South Downs and, backed by cross-channel heavy guns, seized key ports at Newhaven and Folkestone. Hundreds of German barges filled with troops and heavy weaponry were towed across the Channel without hindrance from the Royal Navy or RAF, landed on the Kent and Sussex coast and immediately headed for London. But the line held. Britain had been reinforced by American weapons and Commonwealth troops. The GHQ line was holding to the south of London, and the Royal Navy and the RAF were regrouping. Hitler launched his secondary plan, codenamed Harpoon, where previously decoy actions in East Anglia and southwest England now became actual flanking movements. Paratroopers landed in South Devon, securing the ex-estuary and allowing a landing facility for German troops and tanks, which quickly seized Exeter, cruelly changing every X in Exeter into a swastika. And then heading north and east along the A38 and A30. A diversionary force engaged at defences at Chard, but it couldn't break through. But the main thrust would come at Bridgewater, which, if it fell, would open the quickest route to Bristol and the industrial Midlands, divert British troops from the southeastern GHQ line, and London would be taken. Churchill and King George would be clapped in irons and thrown in the Tower, and Wembley Stadium turned into a museum for German football in triumph. Unthinkable. The Somerset stop line stretched from the widest part of the river in the north, where a diamond of pillboxes surrounded the barrage balloon hangar on the Pole at Hams, and then running along the east side of the river. In Bridgewater itself, the western half of the town would be evacuated, and in fact bombed by the RAF to prevent it being easily occupied, whilst the eastern part of the town, from the river to the railway line, in fact the present-day boundaries of the Eastover ward, fortified as an anti-tank island. And then the line of the canal south going through Somerset Bridge down to Creek St. Michael, more pillboxes, anti-tank traps and bridges mined and ready to be blown on the approach of enemy forces, still visible today. But of course, we all now know the Great Battle of Bridgewater turned the course of the war. The Germans were repelled with heavy losses. The successful policy of interior lines and a mobile reserve meant that the British were able to rapidly switch reinforcements to key areas. And while the Bridgewater defences held, the Royal Navy retook the channel and cut supply lines. The British Army counterattacked and swept victory along the southwest peninsula, and heroic actions at Wiveliscombe, Bishop's Lydeard and Spaxton are now remembered by every school child across the country on Bridgewater Day, September the 22nd. Incidentally, my birthday, and coincidentally, that of Arthur Lowe. But there was tragedy, including the infamous High Bridge unpleasantness, whereafter artichokes were never grown locally again for fear of the flashbacks. And for Hitler, waking up to the name Bridgewater on his front pages twice in his life was too much. So he shot himself 4 years earlier than planned, and the war ended a lot sooner than everybody thought it would. Well, of course it didn't. Let's just go back to September the 7th. On September the 7th, the church bells did indeed ring out, and the code word Cromwell was issued. But the massive German air raids, in reality, changed focus from the RAF to the cities, and in one stroke took the pressure off the British Air Force, which regrouped and had famously won the Battle of Britain by mid-September. The Royal Navy never lost control of the English Channel, and nor would it. And to make things worse, the German army didn't have the resources for a major amphibious operation, and field commanders constantly advised Hitler against an invasion. General Holder saying, "It would be like putting my men through a sausage machine," and that's not a good Saturday afternoon. General Allenbrook, in his diaries too, also clearly said he would have used mustard gas without a moment's hesitation, even on the beaches. The German Navy itself was the most fearful of even attempting an invasion. They knew the weather in the Channel was totally unpredictable and really not the best conditions for towing flat-bottomed river barges, even the smallest of distances. In fact, barge conversions wouldn't be finished properly until mid-September, by which time windows of good weather were becoming less and less accessible. And they knew that even a couple of British minesweepers and destroyers in amongst them would have caused chaos amongst the troop carriers before they even got to the beaches. Never mind the fact that there was a full 6 hours of difference in the high tides from Lyme Regis to Dover. And of course, British militarily, Britain actually didn't stand alone. It was quite strong militarily and economically. The British Empire covered a third of the globe, and we had no end of access to raw materials and manpower. An entire division of Canadians was in Britain already. 500,000 US Enfield rifles and 975mm field guns were now in the hands of the now properly uniformed Home Guard, who themselves now numbered 1.5 million men. Now, also at Sandhurst in 1974, they did attempt to wargame a German invasion. And while the Germans did land, they still lost. In fact, the Germans' own wargaming of 1940 concluded that there was such a small window of opportunity for invasion, in fact, 22nd of September to 6th of August, that all arms of the services were urging a summer 41 invasion instead. But Hitler was far too absorbed with his plans to invade Russia by then anyway, which he did. And by Christmas 1941, he was at war with both the Soviet Union and the Americans, and he was doomed, of course. So why the stop lines? Well, of course, it might have happened, and my very realistic scenario shows this only too well. But really, it was all about turning Churchill's speech into action, bringing the possibility of invasion home to the people, no matter how remote. Pillboxes along the canal and by the railway station are powerful symbols of what if. What if they did come? Well, we'll be ready. The stop lines were built within a month, a massive infrastructure project, showing that such things are possible, coordinated by military planning and resourced by large and local building contractors. In our case, John Molam's Charles Brand, meeting at a get-together at County Hotel in Taunton under the chairmanship of Mr. Stansell, dishing out lucrative contracts and built by masses of manpower, of which Britain had no shortage of. Not only did we have our own works at the ready, we had thousands of European refugees fleeing Nazi persecution, and we had the raw materials. And in Bridgewater, the canal, of course, was no proper defence. You can wade across it. Temporary bridges could have been thrown down and crossed at ease. Never mind blowing up the existing bridges. And you can still see the charge placements in the bridges now. The River Parrot, on the other hand, was a more formidable crossing with its tides and deep mud. Although recently uncovered documents do show that the High Command had given orders that should Bridgewater be attacked, the west part of the town could be sacrificed and bombed by the RAF. I would also add that the Germans had earmarked Lyme Regis as the western landing point, not Exmouth, but I couldn't use that in my scenario, as that meant they'd have totally missed the western stop line and avoided Bridgewater altogether. The Germans had invaded, and the Nazis had taken over Britain. They had darker plans in place. British fascist leader Oswald Mosley would have been installed as a puppet dictator. Blenheim Palace, Churchill's ancestral home, would have been turned into Nazi HQ. 300,000 British Jews would have been eliminated, and they'd had a hit list of some 3,000 political opponents, their special search list, including Clement Attlee, Noel Coward, Sylvia Pankhurst, H.G. Wells, Ernest Bevin, and Bridgewater's own Vernon Bartlett. Even poor old Chamberlain was on it. However, what an oversight. He'd left off Gracie Fields, George Formby, and Vera Lynn. We could have rebuilt society no problem. So, spoiler alert, Britain wasn't invaded, but the stop lines were real, and they're still there. Well, most of them, often thanks to the farmers who were paid a fiver a head to remove them, and who instead pocketed the fiver and left them there. So today you can walk the canal and the riverbank and see these pillboxes. There's two at Bridgewater Station on the planned anti-tank island, and there's a restored one at Crete St. Michael, which is now a bat sanctuary, an apt reminder of why they were built.
Imagine me on the Maginot Line, sitting on a mine on the Maginot Line. People tell me don't be daft, I just say it'll be a laugh. I see you all in the half-time bath, down in the Maginot Line. Hey, turned out shite again.